Hello, my name's Caroline Beckett and I'm Vicar of Brightlingsea, and I'm currently a refugee in my dining room, very much hoping that I will not be interrupted by teens or dogs or both.
My name's Andy Griffiths. I coordinate training for the Diocese of Chelmsford. I'm upstairs in the bedroom and hoping my back holds out through this call.
And I'm Katie Tupling, co-founder of Disability and Jesus, an online user-led task group about disability and theology. And in my paid job, I am DOS and Disability Advisor for the Oxford Diocese and lead chaplain amongst deaf people. And I'm in the whole of my downstairs, which is all one room, at the dining table.
And together we are at a distance,
rethinking Christian leadership.
Katie, it is so good to welcome you, because this is a podcast about Christian leadership in a pandemic. And Caroline and I have been so aware it would be weird not to turn to the people who've been doing online church for the longest, who are often those with disabilities. So, what do people like me who are new to online church need to do to learn the lessons that we need to be listening to?
That is a really good question, and I wish more people in the C of E were asking it. So just a hint to those higher up the food chain. I asked the same question on my Twitter feed because I'm very aware that disability and Jesus are kind of the teenagers or the middle-age group of those who've been online for quite some time doing church. So I asked practitioners old and new what they came up with. And here's the not definitive list, but a pretty good list of what we talked about. We talked about it being short and sweet. People's attention spans are not what they are perhaps in a physical space, and it's a different way of concentrating. So short and sweet is ideal. Short liturgy, short replies to answers to questions, short sermons or reflections, short songs if you're going to use music. Also, it's about connecting and building relationships rather than collecting and growing numbers. We're not trying to get 15,000 followers in 4 years by doing online church. We're trying to connect with people who may not feel they're being connected with in a way that they once flourished. Small is beautiful, don't chase the large. You may well be used to being in a warehouse with a band and smoke, which is fantastic, but that doesn't necessarily work online. Small is beautiful, and people want to have relationships, not showmanship. Signpost others, because if you can't do something you long to and someone else is doing it, go signpost them. Don't try and recreate something you're not. And that leads on to be yourself. You have to be authentically who you are, because although the camera never lies, well, it does, it also sees you. And if people see a version of you and then meet you in real life, they're going to be disappointed that they saw a persona and not the genuine you. It's public forever. So remember, what comes out of your mouth will be captured in perpetuity, whether you like it or not. Have a filter between the thought and the words that just says, am I okay with this? If my gran was watching, would she approve? Or the bishop. They're the same person, you're in luck. Practice before you hit record. Practice with yourself in your own room, play it back, watch yourself. It's painful to do, but you will realize the things that irritate you probably will irritate everybody else. Get the sound right, the light right, the atmosphere right, and then go live or record for the first time. Nearly there. It is new to you, but it's not new. There's been people online doing church and being church for a long time. iChurch, St. Pixels, Ship of Fools, they were the ones that really pioneered it 15, 20 years ago. And we've learned from them, and people are now learning from us. Before we finish, offline or online, keep it authentic.
Cool. So how has the experience of COVID lockdown been for you, Katie?
Tedious. I mean, I'm an introvert hermit.
Dogs, no, dogs.
I love it. This is where live, real life and recorded life clash, and it's brilliant. It's as it should be.
I'm not pausing the recording because this is real. Katie, you keep telling us, how's your experience of lockdown been?
So we began as a household to self-isolate on around the 16th of March, which is before the government started to actually get serious publicly about COVID. My husband is a kidney transplant recipient, so we were sniffing around the whole, this is going to get serious quickly. So we began to isolate ourselves in the household, and then lockdown came. And then my husband got the official thing of, oh, you're extremely vulnerable. You shouldn't even breathe unless you can help it. And we decided, should he shield, which is no contact with anybody whatsoever, in the top floor of our house. It's not an attic, it's a conversion. Don't get weird on me like that. I'm not going to banish him to the attic. Where we have a separate toilet and shower and bedroom. And then we just hand him very carefully his food across the doorway and anti-bac everything we touch. Or do we just shield as an entire household? And that meant we can continue being family without the risk of bringing COVID into the house and without the risk of family life disintegrating. So we've gone for complete shielding, which does mean that when people talk about lifting a lockdown, we're like, well, nice for you. We'll see you in September or Christmas, maybe next year. The government food boxes were helpful in the first instance when they eventually came. Our local online superstore finally got us on the vulnerable list, having deliveries rather than having to go and queue up unsuccessfully. So the system kind of kicked in, which was good when it worked. And local church has been fabulous. We've got a buddy system. They buy us milk every few days, which is fab. So when the systems work, it's great. It is a little bit weird hearing life returning to normal outside. And it's as noisy during this week as it ever was before lockdown. So I'm frustrated by some who are playing the system, and I'm in solidarity with those like us having to shield and changing the language of vulnerable to coronavirus. Just because you're vulnerable to the virus doesn't mean you're vulnerable in life and can be written off. So there's lots of mixed feelings, and I'm going to blog about it at some point this next week.
So, Katie, I guess helping people think about power and the ways, and just something like that, the ways in which that you're represented, the ways in which people speak about you rather than to you, perhaps, and the things that you can and can't accomplish and the barriers in the way and what have you. I guess thinking about power with people has been a part of your role. And we've been thinking about planning and power. So how do you get people to recognise power when you work with other disabled Christians?
That is also a good question. You're making me think hard today. And when I got this sort of brief from you and time to think, it's taken me about 4 days to come up with that's a really good question. Because there is a frustration amongst disabled activists who are not part of churches and will never be because they can't stand their perception of church. And disabled activists within the church, like Disability in Jesus, You Belong, Struggling Saints, all online, of trying to be the authentic voice of our disabilities and our conversations about discipleship, about power, about authority, about integrity, about honesty within that disabled context. And trying to engage with each other as a community has been interesting because we're very diverse. Trying to engage with the activists out there who don't do church but have a big platform from which they can be influential in society, and trying to get the system to listen when our message maybe doesn't necessarily fit with how the system has always operated for generations. It's that thing about speaking truth, careful, to power. And power doesn't always want to listen. And it's the thing about being an Old Testament prophet where you say, this is true, but you're not going to like it. So I think people like Disability in Jesus, of which I'm co-founder, we have an awful lot to say, but we're very aware it doesn't make us very popular, and the system will always self-protect, whether that's the Church of England or Parliament or whoever. So there's something about having courage. There's something about making sure this is a godly truth to power rather than opinion. There's something about checking out how you feel with your community. Is it just me? And there's something about just saying it. And if nothing comes of it, well, at least you know you've said it. Nothing about us without us, with the civil rights cry of the 60s from disability activists in America first. And it's true, it has to involve us. But actually, if you're going to change a system, we have to be at the heart and center of the table conversation. not just invited in as a token gesture and then tick the box, we've heard from them, now they've gone, let's get on with it anyway.
We have a saying in community organising, actually, if you don't have a seat at the table, then you're on the menu. And that's actually very true in so many contexts, if you think about it. Now, you've both talked about a theological model of exile and a theological model of exodus. And that does seem to be one of the metaphors that is being used for our times, and one of the places that people are drawing from in Scripture at the moment. And I just wonder if you can talk about that a little bit.
So shall I go first? It seems to me that a lot of Christians, especially male Christians and abled Christians, people like me, in other words, have tended to think of this time of being banished from churches as a bit like the Babylonian exile. So the idea is we used to have a good, stable worshipping life, but then we lost it. So we sat down lamenting by the waters of Babylon, or at least on the balconies of our flats, just longing to go back to our thin places. There's an understanding that good can come out of this experience, just as the synagogue system came out of the exile. But the idea is that the sooner the exile ends, the better. And I'm one of those people that has used that metaphor, and I think it's got something going for it. There was a very influential article by Tom Wright, previous Bishop of Durham, that developed that. I think it's good in that it insists that lamenting is a key part of the process in this way of thinking about life. But more recently, we become aware that Exodus is also a possible model, and exile isn't the only model around.
I'm glad you mentioned Exodus, because I've been pondering this. Ironically, it came across my radar because I was doing some daily Bible readings on Twitter Live about 2-3 weeks ago, and the Exodus story in Exodus, or is it Deuteronomy, was the actual readings for the day. And as I began doing them live on Twitter and Facebook and thinking about it, I thought, this is what we're doing. This is coronavirus all over. So to simplify it down quickly, there is a previously familiar and semi-attractive system of life, which was slavery in Egypt. They'd only ever known that. They'd never known anything different. They had nothing to compare it with. And for some, it kind of worked. You know, they even muttered about it in the desert. We had food, we had a clean living space, we had a roof over our head, and we knew what we were doing. Everything was laid out for us. We didn't have to think, we just got on with it. And there's a longing for what was before. I'm not saying the Church of England is the slave master, but we can all be beholden to systems that we never questioned. So the previous system was familiar and attractive. They now find themselves in this nomadic place where they don't have a roof over their heads. They don't have food like they had, and they have no one telling them what to do. So they're having to think creatively for the first time and organize themselves into a society model that they've never had. They're having to work out disagreements and decide on pecking orders and stuff. They've never had that as slaves. So this idea about being on a journey with no actual timeline for destination and arrival, having to think creatively in a space that they're not used to occupying. Is that familiar? With leaders who they either do trust or don't trust and whinge about, or uphold brilliantly and say, we'll help you. Does that sound familiar too? And then what they're heading for, but they don't know when, is a new normal. I really hate that phrase, but it kind of works. A new normal where they take what they learned from slavery, they take what they learned from the wanderings, and they arrive and have to work out now, in the light of this land, what do we do now from what we've learned from Egypt and from the desert? And I think I would go with Exodus, because it's slightly less whingy and lamenty, although you do need both. And I will point out that for a lot of disabled people and marginalised communities like BAME and LGBT, This Exodus experience of wilderness has been normal for a lot of years because the mainstream church has said, you don't belong, don't even try.
No, absolutely.
And I second that, actually, because some of the work that I do at Greenbelt Festival involves having a space where people can come and be welcomed, and there is no this event is for these kind of people. It's just, this is the event, and you're all welcome. And we've deliberately tried to make the liturgy intentionally inclusive of everybody. And I had two conversations that really struck me last Greenbelt, and actually there's a lot of mourning that Greenbelt won't be happening, because for some people, one person said, this is my church once a year. This is the time I come to church once a year. And this person was living a kind of a Passover model of only really coming close once a year, because she came from the LGBTQI community, had a very complex story, was a profoundly wonderful person, but had been systematically hurt again and again and again and again and again by various manifestations of organised church. And the second was somebody who, like me, was a bit alternative, and had actually come to faith and had turned up at a church and sat in the pew, and it was pews, but it might easily not have been. And at the end of the service, having felt that they profoundly connected with God, they were then approached by a member of the church who asked them not to return. And when they asked why, they were told, because we don't want people out there to think that this is a church for people like you. So
I mean, I'm horrified but not surprised. Yeah.
So I do have, I normally supply a poem, and this is this week's poem, and it is an unapologetically angry one. But it's a prayer for anger, and we often don't think about anger in a positive way, just as we often don't think of power in a positive way. But this kind of does. So, God, I am angry. I roil, I seethe. Give me something on which to teethe. Make me an arrow. Let me fly. Grant me a target, a grief, a lie, a loss, an injustice, a need, a task. Wield me for glory. This I ask. Amen.
Amen. Beautiful. Thank you. Now, in this series of conversations, we've been thinking through a process of community organising, which starts with organising, moves on to listening, and then planning. Caroline, can you give us an example of how that process has worked out for a project that you've been involved in?
So probably the most obvious example of going almost completely from scratch was that we managed to get women-only swimming in our local leisure centre. And it started because we ran a community organising day, and along to that day came a number of wonderful ladies from the Bangladeshi Women's Group and various other women's organisations within our local mosque. And we were doing a listening in the community at that stage for what really mattered to the people who were turning up and what really mattered to them. And I would never have thought of this. And this just goes to show that you really do have to listen to people, because I, from my position, if you'd asked me to list the likely issues they would come up with, this would not even have existed at all on my radar. But they said the biggest issue for them was they couldn't go swimming. And many of them couldn't swim. And they couldn't swim for exercise, even though some of their doctors had prescribed it. And they couldn't swim with their children because they couldn't be unclothed in the presence of men. And the changing rooms were mixed, and the swimming pool was mixed. And so they had that experience that most of us take for granted, completely denied to them. And they had approached the leisure centre and they hadn't even got a meeting. They didn't want to know. They just told them it wasn't possible. So we did some listening, and we found that there were lots of other groups of women who actually felt excluded from swimming as well. People with poor body image, people who had the scars of self-harm, people who'd had operations, ladies who were a little bit overweight, ladies who were a little bit older and felt self-conscious, ladies who'd been victims of sexual assault, there was this whole group of women for whom this was an issue. And so having collected these stories, we approached Leisure World and said, will you give us a meeting? And they said, no, because it's not possible. We can't give you what you want. So we organised. We got a group of women. We got about 52, 53, something like that, ladies together. And we went to Leisure World, and we didn't want to make enemies. We didn't want to shout with placards. So what we did do was we gathered all the stories together. We got a microphone in a boombox, courtesy of Bishop Roger, and we stood outside Leisure World. And it was coming up to Valentine's Day. So we'd written a giant Valentine's card with all the things we loved about Leisure World and why we particularly wanted the swimming to be there. And then we all stood around and we told the stories, and each storyteller held a rose. And then we sang a little song we'd made up to the tune of I Can't Help Falling in Love with You, but the words were, we can't help wanting to swim with you. And we told the stories and we played games with water balloons, and we all wore swimwear outside our clothes, and we had a rollicking good time. And we presented them with a massive petition, and we said, will you meet with us? And they not only gave us a meeting, they gave us a hearing. 12 different people from local organisations turned up, which freaked the life out of them because they'd had no idea there was that much power going to be in the room. And we actually got, a long story short, we got a pilot 12 sessions of women swimming and some funding, and so they got the opportunity to go swimming. That's not the end of the story, but that's where I'll leave it for now. But we got our seat at the table. We were no longer just on the menu.
I love that story, and what it's doing is it's taking us beyond planning into action, and action is going to be the theme of our next conversation.
Yeah, so thank you for listening. And you can get in touch with us. Please do get in touch with us. So I'm at revcarolinebeckett@gmail.com.
And I'm at randomlyandy@live.com.
And we want to thank you, Katie, for joining us today. And we have been At a Distance,
Rethinking Christian leadership.